Good afternoon. Yes, okay. I am on a microphone. Welcome, everybody. I'm David Gregory. I cover the White House for NBC News, among some other duties. And welcome to the Press Club. It's terrific to have you here for what I hope will be a very interesting discussion and a very good lunch, I hope, as well. Our focus today is going to be American foreign policy. An examination of where we've been, particularly in the Bush years after 9/11, and particularly with regard to the election next year, to look at what the mission is for U.S. foreign policy going forward as the two parties square off and try to get control of the White House. And one of the threads of our discussion today will be to talk about American values and the role that they play and have played in foreign policy in this age of terror since 9/11. Our discussion, as you can see behind me, is sponsored by Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School as part of their regular Washington Seminar series of events. And so again, as we have entitled today's program, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World. By a remarkable coincidence, I'm sure this is really just a coincidence, that is also the subtitle for one of our participants' new book. And we'll be repeating the phrase every 2 or 3 minutes. And by the way, the book that we're talking about is The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World, which happens to be the subtitle of our program today, by Dean Anne-Marie Slaughter of Princeton University. This book will be available outside, and I think the dean might even sign a few copies. We're going to take on the subject of the role of values in American policymaking, and so we have Dean Slaughter. We're also, of course, honored to have with us the 64th Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. Thank you very much for being with us, Madam Secretary. Secretary Albright is currently the principal of the Albright Group and is also a professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Her most recent book is titled The Mighty and the Almighty: Reflections on America, God, and World Affairs. And as I mentioned, with us is Anne-Marie Slaughter as well, author of her new book, The Idea That Is America. Anne-Marie is Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton and is a recent president of the American Society of International Law. She also serves as chair of the current Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on Democracy Promotion. So I will pose some questions to our guests here, and after a little bit of time hearing from them, we'll also take your questions as well. We have a couple of microphones, as you can see, so if you come up with a question, identify yourself and pose your question, and we'll get right to it. Since this is sort of the focus of my day today, I like to be topical, since driving the news is a very important topic of foreign policy, and that's the war in Iraq. And in a highly charged political climate, that is not just about immigration, but where the vote is today, but about Iraq as well. Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana came out last night and effectively said, the president's got it wrong. He needs a new policy in Iraq, and a policy that revolves around the idea of the withdrawal of American troops or the redeployment of those troops within Iraq. So this is sending some shockwaves around Washington, as you've no doubt heard about or read about, since this is a Republican of some standing now who is beginning to challenge the president when he has been relying politically on the idea that Republicans would stay behind him, stay the course, wait for General David Petraeus to issue his report, and that he could somehow keep this idea of a surge strategy moving forward. So, Secretary Albright, let me begin with you on what is such a topical event. What's the significance of this?
Well, I think it's very significant, David. I'm very glad to be here also with my good friend Anne-Marie. First of all, Senator Lugar is a highly respected member of Congress and now ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He had been chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee through a great deal of the lead up to the war in Iraq, and then obviously the continuation or the the carrying out of it. He is somebody, I think, who I can tell you from testifying in front of him many times, he is a very careful and considered thinker, somebody who has a great deal of experience in foreign affairs, and somebody that the administration has relied on. And for him to make the statement at this particular stage, especially when there's discussion about waiting for General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker's, ambassador to Iraq's, statements, and they're kind of waiting until September for him to kind of pull this June surprise, I think is of importance and may, in fact, develop a greater ripple effect. I mean, we've seen Senator Gordon Smith from Oregon make anti-war statements. Senator Hagel, who I think I'm sitting here for, was also somebody who's been critical of the war, and I think that there's going to be more and more. The person I'm waiting for, as important as Senator Lugar is Senator Warner, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and I think that it'll be interesting to see because he is a military expert and someone who was Secretary of the Navy, and is also very important in terms of what kind of support the president has. But this is a failed policy, and some people recognize that sooner than others, and I think it is very important that Senator Lugar has spoken out.
Is this the beginning, Dean Slaughter, of the fall of the Republicans? And if so, what's the conversation like in the White House about what to do and how quickly to do it?
I wouldn't want to be in the White House today, I think. But one way I think you could understand this is Senator Lugar saying, look, when we come back, and they haven't adjourned yet, but obviously we're starting to well into the summer. When we come back in September, we can't just keep temporizing. By doing this, he's giving cover to a lot of other Republicans to push harder against the war. And what that also means then is if in September General Petraeus says, well, we really can't tell, and we've gotten a lot of signals that that is partly what we're going to get, Lugar's serving notice that just continuing to wait and pray for a deus ex machina to somehow save us is not going to be good enough. So it's really a call for a policy, for a real policy, not simply a hope that the surge has worked, but rather a statement of what are our objectives and how are we going to achieve them. A number of people on the Democrat side and the Republican side, but particularly the Democrats, have been saying it's not just about withdrawal, it's about what does Iraq look like when we withdraw, and how do we actually plan our withdrawal in such a way that we are not getting pushed back in or we're going to be witnessing a genocide. So I think it's a call for a real policy.
Madam Secretary, do you see this president, the way he's conducted the policy heretofore, abandoning discussion of actual victory in Iraq and just speaking to the American people about the consequences of withdrawal and some of the challenges of withdrawal to try to build consensus?
Well, you are more familiar with his language, I think, than anybody. I have a feeling that he will not ever state it that way, that there will be some way of still talking about it as a victory of some kind. I have very strong views about this president, and I think he is not related to reality. And therefore, I think that he is going to have a hard time saying that this is not that there's some real shift in he has to say there's a shift, but not that it is not a victory of some kind for the United States. But let me just say, it is hard, I think, to be the leader of a country and to say that a policy that you instigated is as big a failure as this one. So I would allow him some space in terms of the way that he describes what's going on, if in fact there is a radical change in policy that comes out of a discussion, as Dean Slaughter was talking about.
I think this is a momentous time in the country and a fascinating time when you look at American foreign policy, because it is at this pivot point where we're going to have a new president, a Republican or a Democrat, and there will be a shift in policy in some direction, because the Bush years have been marked with some distinction, whether you think that distinction is a positive or a negative one. But Dean Slaughter, let me ask you, as we've talked about the subtitle of your book, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World. And by dangerous world, I think we agree, we mean particularly after 9/11. So let's we'll come back to the question of Iraq, but start at that point. Have we or have we not kept faith with American values in the post-9/11 era?
I think we've distorted our values. Indeed, I think our values have been deeply misrepresented at best and outright distorted at worst. The reason I chose to subtitle my book, Keeping Faith with Our Values, or to write about our values, was the sense that there are a set of values that I think most Americans would say we stand for. Certainly liberty, democracy, justice, and equality. You can get those out of our founding documents. Secretary Albright's speeches and the foreign policy of the Clinton administration was about enlarging democracy, standing for justice and liberty. But the way those values have been portrayed and interpreted have made a mockery of them in some cases. I mean, to be talking about standing for justice when we're doing what we're doing in Guantanamo simply exposes us as global hypocrites. Similarly, democracy has come to mean either we're going to overturn your government and establish a new one, or at best, we're going to hold elections and hope everything works and goes home. So I think part of what we do need is a value-based foreign policy. That is something I think there's really bipartisan consensus on, but how we define those values and how we stand for them is a critical question.
Secretary Albright, the same question to you. Have we or have we not lived up to those values?
I think we have not. I mean, I believe very much that the U.S. needs a moral foreign policy, meaning that it abides by the values that Dean Slaughter has spoken about, in addition to a sense that we are part of an international system. But we have had instead a moralistic foreign policy, where we are lecturing everybody all the time and do not really have a comprehension of how our values are viewed abroad without, in fact, keeping to the values ourselves. I think what has happened to our civil liberties is tragic. It's one thing to be at an airport and stand there. I do this all the time, and they specifically choose me for whatever reason. And then I say, you have your, and then they ask for an autograph, and I say, well, you have your choice. But that is an inconvenience. But what is happening to our to the wiretapping issues or the questions about Guantanamo or a variety of things, those are have a real impact, and therefore we are expecting a replica of our value system in places that have difficulty doing that while not abiding by them ourselves. And so any number of aspects I have said in my book, and often you hope, I'm sure that Dean Slaughter feels this way, is that when you write a book, you hope everything that you've predicted will come true. I actually hope that something that I said would not come true, but it has come true. And that is that I think that Iraq will go down in history as the greatest disaster in American foreign policy, meaning worse than Vietnam, not in the number of people who have died, either Americans or Iraqis or Vietnamese, but in terms of its unintended consequences. And one of them is the undermining of America's moral authority, which I think is very, very important in terms of what we say about human rights and torture and treatment of minorities and legal systems, et cetera. So it has, in fact, is damaging in that particular way.
There's a couple of issues that I think are laid out there. One, though, having to do with civil liberties in this country, the treatment of detainees, speaks to a fundamental question, which is, did this country and this government, therefore, face such a unique threat that extraordinary measures were necessary, even over the idea of national or international consensus?
So let me answer that, but let me first respond to Secretary Albright's point on Iraq. I think I'm still more optimistic that it needn't be the worst foreign policy disaster in the United States, but it goes back to what you were talking about before in terms of what do we do now. One of the values I write about is humility, and people hear humility, you must be joking. We're certainly not known for humility now, but over our history, that has in fact been a value, but it goes back to the question of whether or not we should actually acknowledge that we have made a serious mistake and whether that would actually help. And Secretary Albright said, you know, it's hard for a president to do that. I think there's no question. But presidents have had U-turns before. I mean, Nixon went to China, Reagan at Reykjavik. They didn't apologize. They didn't say we're, but they did say fundamentally what we were doing was wrong and we're going to do the opposite. I think there are people both in the military and certainly in the diplomatic corps who argue that the willingness to acknowledge that we've actually really made a mistake and we now need to change course would help shift the debate so that it wasn't constantly our redefining what democracy is, but instead saying, look, you know, we thought there were weapons of mass destruction. There weren't. We thought we could come in here with 150,000 troops and create a stable democracy. We couldn't. Now we are all in a situation in which we in the region and we and those people within Iraq have to figure out where we go from here.
But can I just interject? We'll stay with this because I think this is important. What specifically was the mistake that this administration made? Not getting into the question of just execution, but the fundamental point of we're making this decision to invade Iraq. What was the mistake that they should be accountable for?
I think the fundamental mistake they should be accountable for is not being willing to actually play by the rules of the United Nations and listen to other countries so that if for another 3 weeks, possibly a month, which is what the British wanted to do, you actually looked to see what the inspectors said and you abided by the Security Council. In retrospect, of course, the others were right, and we were committed to do that. The President said it was about the United Nations, but of course it was clear it wasn't about United Nations sanctions because he'd already decided to invade, and he'd already decided to invade because of his language. That would be for starters. That would be a fairly major acknowledgement that, you know what, this system actually was working and we disregarded it and we've paid the price.
That we rushed the process. But it is fair to point out, a reading of history, that there was agreement in the international community about action and the finding that he had weapons or was working toward weapons. Where they got bogged down and where the French departed was on the notion of what consequences there would be.
Well, first of all, I think that it's very important to say the following, that getting rid of Saddam Hussein, regime change, was something that we had talked about in the Clinton administration, not by invasion, but we hoped very much that he would be overthrown. I think that, and in 1998, the people who brought us this war had come to the Clinton administration and asked us to set up a beachhead for Chalabi, which we thought was not a good idea. So, but I spent my time as UN ambassador as well as Secretary of State working to try to create situations where the sanctions regimes would work, where there would be maybe some group that would think that they might want to replace Saddam Hussein. I also, and most of us that were everybody in the administration, actually believed that there were weapons of mass destruction by deduction. Because what happened, and I think most people don't know this, is the weapons inspectors from '91 on actually destroyed more weapons of mass destruction than the Gulf War itself had. And in 1998, when they left, they had not yet accounted for all the weapons, so just by deduction. But I never thought, and I think this is one of the mistakes, is that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat to the United States. He had no delivery system for it, and that therefore we should take our eye off the ball of Afghanistan, whence the 9/11 killers had come, in order to all of a sudden have this hysterical approach to Saddam Hussein. And I agree totally with Dean Slaughter. The victory that Bush won by the vote in Congress was to go to the United Nations with the support of the U.S. Senate in order to push for the inspectors to go back in. He won that. It was a big deal, and he won the vote at the UN, and he didn't follow up on it. And that is the biggest mistake, because in a few weeks they would have found that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and then there would not have been a reason to go to this war, so it becomes a logic train.
Is there still the reality that in a 9/11 world you're confronted with the question of, do we leave this bad actor on the chessboard?
Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
We had no evidence that he was
linked.
connected to 9/11.
But we knew he was a bad actor. We knew that he had... There are lots of bad actors, but this isn't a key part of... I mean, there was a great deal of pressure from all sides, I remember, during the debate, where it was a debate about, did you recognize what was happening, before 9/11? Did you see the warning signs? And there was a great deal of pressure to say, well, what's the next big thing in the way of terror threats? So when you have an actor like this who has designs to have weapons, can you keep him on the chessboard if you're trying to refashion that part of the world?
I see it a little bit differently. I see 9/11 there exposing a fundamental fault line between this administration and the previous administration that is, I think, a betrayal of our values in the sense that it showed that the preference was to fight back alone. If you remember, when NATO wanted to invoke Article 5 after 9/11 to say, we've all been attacked, the administration initially didn't even want them to do that. There was immediately a sense that, we're going to do this, we're going to do this alone. We've been attacked, and we're going to respond. We're not going to have a war like Kosovo where we have to work with many other nations. And so at a moment when actually the world was incredibly with us, and with all respect to Secretary Albright, a lot of anti-Americanism was growing in Europe in the late 1990s, mostly around the International Criminal Court and the Landmines Treaty. And after 9/11, there was this moment to come back together and to work within international institutions with other countries where they did recognize a common threat. And instead, we effectively said, look, we've been attacked, we're the most powerful nation, and we're going to do it alone. And that, I think, was really a betrayal of the way we have defined our security, but also a notion that, as I write about, of humility, that we are not, we may be the most powerful, but we're not, you put it always this way, we're not omnipotent or omniscient.
No, I mean, I used to say that we are an indispensable nation, and I believe that. But indispensable does not mean alone.
That's right.
And it was that mistake of thinking that we had to do it by ourselves. Any number of things. I mean, there are lots of mistakes involved here, I think.
Talk about where we are now, though, in this debate about what happens when U.S. forces leave. And I think there is consensus around the idea that they will leave. It's a question of when and how. What happens in Iraq and beyond?
Can we go back on something that you said and Dean Slaughter said, is about democracy. I happen to be chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, which is an organization that has been promoting democracy since the early 80s as a result of a speech that President Reagan made in England. So I believe in promoting democracy. That's a little different than imposing democracy, which is an oxymoron. And what happened was that Iraq has militarized the concept of democracy. And Anne-Marie, you wrote about how exciting it was to see the purple fingers, and NDI actually was in Iraq, and there are people who have a great desire to run themselves and to have a sense that they can be Iraqis, not just Kurds or Shias or Sunnis. So but the problem is that what President Bush did was undermine the word democracy, because it's militarized democracy, and that doesn't work.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that you bring democracy in with guns, and that you are trying to get instead of working on a political solution, we are still working on the military part. Now, for me, the biggest problem here is that the American presence is both the solution and the problem. People can't be expected to rebuild their country or feel that they have a stake in it if they're terrified, and therefore providing security is a very important part, and that's what the Americans are doing. Now, I believe that we do have to leave because we are like a magnet and have actually created more terrorists than were there in the first place, but we can't leave them totally insecure. And so I think there's a two-pronged path here. One is deciding how many Americans need to stay, which I think is what the discussion is about now. What numbers, whether they are there to deal with some of the al-Qaeda encampments, protect our base, our embassy, but not have permanent bases and be somewhere around the borders in order not to have it spread. And this is where I think that others bear a responsibility. The United States did not start World War I or World War II. But when we saw that it affected our national interest, we went in there and everything changed. I think other countries, including Europeans who did not agree with how this war started, it affects their national interest now, maybe even more than it does ours. And they need to get in there and help in training the Iraqis and providing security. It means also they have to help in the reconstruction, which means that we have to give up the contracts. But there needs to be, this issue needs to be internationalized. And so we need to stay long enough in order to withdraw in an organized way, and then the international community needs to begin to take some responsibility for it.
I can amplify that a little bit. I also think the definition of democracy is just far too simple. Part of the research I was doing, if you go back to the Federalist Papers, you don't find a single mention of the word democracy, except for when James Madison is telling you why it won't work. And of course, he's talking about direct democracy back in Athens, or Hamilton says, you know, we have a republic, and a republic is the only way between the extremes of despotism on the one hand and democracy on the other. Now, some of that, of course, is 18th century language versus 20th century language, but a lot of it's something more, which is that the founders understood fundamentally that democracy is an instrument to secure liberty under law. It is not an end in itself. It is a means of getting to a political system in which power is not abused and individuals can flourish. And that includes independent courts, checks and balances. It certainly includes representative government, but representative in many different ways. And we still don't have one man, one vote today, right? I mean, if you live in Wyoming, your vote counts infinitely more than mine does in New Jersey. So the point here is to not be equating democracy with elections. It's to be thinking about democracy as a liberal democracy, as a complicated system that includes a whole set of institutions as well as representative government. And that then goes directly back to what Secretary Albright was saying about thinking about this as a 10-year project minimum, and then thinking about how do you anchor a particular country to other countries in the region, outside the region, as, for instance, the EU does with its candidate members, to support this process on an ongoing basis. And the only thing I'd add, I agree the Europeans have an important role to play. I think the Indians have a role to play. We should stop thinking about the Middle East as, you know, here we are, here's Europe, and then there's the Middle East. Instead, if you look at India, the world's largest democracy, on the one side and Europe on the other, and a whole region that needs, I think rightly, to move toward liberal democracy slowly, and it's going to be difficult, the Indians have a role to play as well.
But Secretary Albright, which country do you expect to step up and help to make this an international problem? I mean, the president was just at the G8 in Germany, and things were better between all of them because Iraq doesn't even come up. Right. They don't even discuss it. That's how it is. They've moved on to fighting each other over something else.
Well, it's hard because there has not been the usage of the tool of, you know, talking to other countries. That's what diplomacy is, and dealing with what their interests are, and that has rusted the approach. I think it would be very hard. I think the Indian idea is a very good one. The countries in the region are very important. I think also, as everybody knows, Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country, Malaysia, a number of other countries, that if it were evident that this was now an international issue, but this requires quite a different approach, which I'm not sure that, I mean, there is some reality check going on in the administration in terms of the North Korean issue, or even beginning to talk to Iran. I think that maybe there's time in terms of them beginning to look more at diplomacy more widely. It's not easy. None of this is easy. And, you know, you talk about leaving somebody on the chessboard. I have stopped talking about diplomacy as chess. I think that what it is a game of billiards or pool, where you hit a ball and you hope it gets to the other side, but in the meantime it's hit a lot of other balls. It's very horizontal. And that's what's happened here, is that they're all kind of going off in different directions and making it very hard.
Okay, so the balls are where they are on the billiard table, and it is January, or say February 1st, 2009. You both are there in this new administration, Republican or Democrat, up at Camp David, where the new president will presumably want to go and say, okay, here is where we are. What is the new mission of U.S. foreign policy after the years we've come through?
I don't think we have a new mission. I just think we have a very different way of getting there. I think the mission is, in fact, that we work with other countries to enlarge the community of democratic states, to provide for, in my language, more a world of liberty under law, but that the way we get there is far more multilateral. I think it starts, again, by our effectively reintroducing ourselves to the world. And the first thing I would do is close Guantanamo. And the second thing I would do is to reinvigorate the Non-Proliferation Treaty bargain, where we actually say, look, we recognize that it's not okay for us to just keep building nuclear weapons and ask other countries to not acquire them, but instead we're going to work to reinvigorate that bargain. Then I'd look at global warming, because if we don't have a planet, it's not really going to make any difference what political system we have. So I think really the mission is the mission that it was laid out after by the Truman administration, has been renewed by most administrations since. But how you get there, whether you actually mean what you say, has to be radically overhauled.
Will that conversation about the new way forward include an ideological war on terror as the top priority?
Well, I doubt that it will be framed in that way, because I hope that the next president will have a better understanding of what terrorism is and how it's created and what the various aspects have to be dealt with. I do think we need to keep the worst weapons out of the hands of the worst people. But we can't just automatically say Islam equates terrorism, or countries that we don't like automatically are those that espouse terrorism. So I do think it will be a big issue. There's no way, and especially I think the thing that we have to keep in mind, and having seen this now several times, a new president does not come in with a clean slate. And one of the real questions for me has been, continue to be very critical of the Bush administration for not having some continuity with some of the issues that we left on the table. I would hope that the next president, when she's inaugurated, that she will fully understand that there are certain issues that that are the bread and butter of diplomacy, that will continue to be, and that you don't get a completely clean slate. And fighting terrorism or dealing with terrorism, I agree with Senator Edwards that there's no way to talk about war on terrorism, but it is a given of our time, and we are going to have to deal with it.
You're saying that it would be a mistake for ABC to become ABB. In other words, if the Bushes said anything but Clinton, for the Democrats to come in and say anything but Bush is also a mistake.
Well, you can't do it, and it's unreasonable, and it scares everybody who deals with us. You know, foreign policy doesn't come in 4-year segments or 8-year segments. It has a train of its own, and there are a variety of issues out there that are going to have to be picked up. With any luck, some of the North Korean stuff will be in train and will have to be dealt with, or maybe there'll be something going on Iran. But what I agree with, totally with Dean Slaughter, is that there, I think, will be a different approach, that there will be a sense that we need other countries. The issues that have been named, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, global warming, pandemic disease, drugs, no matter how strong we are, we cannot deal with alone. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure that out. We have to have other countries, which then means that we're going to have to begin to look at how the international system is functioning, and at the moment it's not. Right. It is out of kilter, and the UN is not working as it should. The EU, I think, maybe has finally finished navel gazing, but you know, and we don't know, there's no regional organization in the Far East. There are a whole host of things. the International Criminal Court that need to be looked at from the perspective of people who actually want the international system to work and want the U.S. to be a part of it.
Can I add something on
Sure.
on fighting terrorists? We're using a very limited spectrum of weapons to fight terrorists, not a war on terror, but to fight global terrorist networks. We need to be using law enforcement and intelligence and special operations. But we also need to be using a much broader, not war of ideas, but contest of ideas, talking about tolerance, another one of our fundamental values, when we're really fighting extremists, and it's not religious extremists, particularly in the Islamic world, but not only, but talking also about faith and the role of faith. Secretary Albright has written recently on faith and politics. I argue faith is one of our fundamental values, but it's not one faith. We have multiple faiths. If you go to the Princeton Baccalaureate Sunday these days, you start with a Christian prayer, and then you hear a reading from the Quran, and then you hear a Veda, and then you hear a Baha'i prayer. And you have an entire mosaic of faiths. Imagine if we were to lead a global interfaith dialogue, if we were to not simply think about it as, radical Islamists who want to kill us, but rather the role of faith in a world of globalization, the role of multiple faiths, the role of tolerance. These are things America's actually uniquely positioned to talk about and to debate with other countries. And yet, instead, we talk about faith-based policy as meaning the evangelical Christian control of a particular part of our policy.
Secretary Albright, you have something to add on the question of faith and foreign policy.
I do, and let me just say that I come from the generation of foreign policy students and practitioners that used to say, X issue is complicated enough. Let's not bring God and religion into it. But the more that I dealt with issues, the more evident it was that we actually needed to understand the role of God and religion. I am not a theologian, and I haven't turned into a religious mystic, but I do think that we need to bring religious leaders into our discussions. Our diplomats have to have an understanding of religion in the countries where they're going, and I am in favor of having religious leaders help in validating discussions. And if I might, because I did, we're here to talk about Anne-Marie's book, but she's good about talking about mine, which I just happen to always carry with me. And it goes a little bit to the mission issues, so if I might. Ours is a country of abundant resources, momentous accomplishments, and unique capabilities. We have a responsibility to lead, but as we fulfill that obligation, we should bear in mind the distinction pointed out by John Adams. Liberty, at least in the sense of free will, is God's gift, not ours. It is also morally neutral. It may be used for any purpose, whether good or ill. Democracy, by contrast, is a human creation. Its purpose is to see that liberty is directed into channels that respect the rights of all. As the world's most powerful democracy, America should help others who desire help to establish and strengthen free institutions. But in so doing, we should remember that promoting democracy is a policy, not a mission, and policies must be tested on the hard ground of diplomacy, practical politics, and respect for international norms. Our cause will not be helped if we're so sure of our rightness that we forget our propensity as humans that we make mistakes. Though America may be exceptional, we cannot demand that exceptions be made for us. We're not above the law, nor do we have a divine calling to spread democracy any more than we have a national mission to spread Christianity. We have, in short, the right to ask, but never to insist or blithely assume that God bless America.
With that, we've got a few minutes for questions. As I mentioned, if you could come up to our microphones.
Maybe we could be linked.
And identify yourself. You want to start in the back here?
Great. Rodney Livingston, SPNN.net. I've got to do the camera. This can be for the Secretary or anybody that chooses to answer. It seems to be that the common basic concept is that the Americans are extract themselves immediately from Iraq, that the Iraqis will commit violence on one another, but it seems perfectly acceptable for Americans in the interim to kill Iraqis. So I'm trying to understand that concept that it's okay for Americans to kill Iraqis, but it's not okay if the Americans leave for Iraqis to kill one another. And the follow-up question to that is, President Bush currently might seem to be in the 23 to 30% approval rating, and that might be incorrect, and the correction may be that President Bush is actually in the 77 or higher percent approval rating based on the lack of discernible or detectable uprising by the American people to show their dissatisfaction.
Well, first of all, I don't think that it's all right for America. You know, I have real problems with this mission in the first place. So I'm not here saying that Americans should be killing Iraqis. Americans should be trying to provide security so that, in fact, the Iraqis can run themselves. I do think that it is unfortunate that as a result of the situation in Iraq, even prior to our arrival, that the Sunni-Shia split and the problem with the Kurds, that's not something that we invented. In fact, it would have been good if we'd understood it. And so I think that to the extent that any security force can prevent the Iraqis killing each other, I think that is a good mission. But I am not for the Iraqis, for Americans just wantonly killing Iraqis. I do think that there is more and more of a sense of outrage in the American public. The election of a Congress in November was a sign of that, and increasing questioning about the direction in which President Bush is going. There is a public outcry.
Let me go over here, please.
Sure. Wafa Mustaqim, Voice of America Persian Service. That's the question from Secretary Albright. You are, I mean, Iran is one of the challenges of U.S. foreign policy. And you specifically are one of the mostly widely quoted by Iranian public on the very critical issue of U.S. helping or orchestrating the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. Do you have any more specific comments on that when we were talking about acknowledging the mistakes? Do you think it was a mistake? And if it is a mistake, do you think the U.S. government should apologize to the Iranian people?
Well, I've spoken on this because there was a period when President Khatami had been elected, and he had a very interesting interview with Christiane Amanpour, in which it was evident that he talked about respecting the U.S., our history, etc., talking about the hostage crisis. I gave a speech responding to him at the Asia Society in which I said that the CIA and the British had participated in the overthrow of Mossadegh. It was a mistake. And I laid out a roadmap for how we could have better relations with Iran. It's a long, complex story. It is evident that at that time the Iranians did not pick up the signals that President Clinton and I were sending. And in my contacts with Iranian Americans and British Iranians and various other Iranians, it has become clear that a number of them believed that it was a big mistake that at that time, when we were looking at ways to normalize the relationship if they gave up support of terrorism, decided they would not have nuclear weapons, and supported the Middle East peace process, that we were in a position to develop a different relationship.
Dean Slaughter, must a candidate for the presidency keep on the table the idea of a preemptive strike against a nuclearized Iran?
I don't think a candidate for the president without the access to the kind of intelligence that we're in the end going to need is going to rule out a particular option. But I actually do think the better response is to focus on how we can try to change the balance of Iranian domestic politics. And there, actually engaging the Iranians, being willing to engage them much more directly than we are doing now is something I would advocate, at the same time that you keep a diplomatic coalition putting the pressure on. The two are not mutually exclusive. isolation of Iraq plays to Ahmadinejad's strengths. I mean, he wants isolation. He wants to be able to portray the United States as wanting to attack Iran. So from my point of view, we need to be both maintaining the diplomatic coalition we are now and engaging, and I would absolutely be open about having made a major mistake in overthrowing Mossadegh. Actually, the Bush administration has recognized that the policy of, what we care about is whether or not you are an ally with us, and we don't care whether you were elected or how you treat your own people that we pursued in the Cold War was a mistake. Long term, we're reaping that harvest today. So it seems to me that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to engage the Iranians on.
Question over here, sir.
Yes. This on? Peter Swire. I'm a law professor now and a fellow at the Center for American Progress. So my question is about the International Criminal Court, which both speakers briefly mentioned. And Anne-Marie's book, which I was reading before the session, talks about values and realism. And so the values side, it would seem, would be we should join the criminal court because we'll have a rule of law internationally, and that's going to show that we're part of the moral community, not going on our own. But when I was in government, I heard strong arguments the other way about the risk to the next Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State who's being indispensable, taking leadership in the United States, going out on a limb when everybody's not on board, and then if it goes badly, being prosecuted as a war criminal later on. So how do you find your way between the values of being in the international community and the realism, which is the United States can become a target when we go out and take a leadership position?
Well, I would start with the facts, which is that the British, of course, are members of the ICC. A lot of NGOs actually submitted complaints to the prosecutor about British war crimes in Basra, in Iraq. So they are subject to the ICC, they are subject to the jurisdiction, and the prosecutor looked at all those complaints and said, yes, probably war crimes were committed, and somewhere between 12 and 15 people probably died as a result, and that was something serious, but the British could obviously take care of it, and it was so small in comparison to the crimes involving hundreds of thousands of people and genocide and crimes against humanity in Africa, that this was not a matter for the court. So we have actual examples of how the court deals with this kind of an issue. The other way to think about it is just a straight cost-benefit calculation. Yes, there are costs. If we sign up to the court, there will be more investigations likely to be started because under the doctrine of complementarity, states have responsibility to deal with their own prosecutions, and we have a fine military justice system which will do that. But it does mean more investigations may get started. On the benefit side, we would be part of an institution that could actually indict someone like Saddam Hussein after he gassed the Kurds in 1988, or Milosevic after the first massacre at Vukovar, was something our military, I think, would benefit from. It would also mean that we would then be able to be standing side by side with other nations around the world, actually talking about as American exceptionalism, but not American exemptionalism, claiming that we get some kind of special exemption because we, after all, are America.
Comment, Madam Secretary?
Well, having been part of the negotiation here, this is exactly was the issue that the Pentagon was particularly concerned about what would happen to our military. And there's a reason to be concerned because our military is more widespread throughout the world than other places. And I think that one of the things that had there been a President Gore, I think what would have happened is that we would have continued to be part of the discussions. So that while we would not have signed up for the ICC immediately, we would have been a part of discussing what the law of aggression were and preemption and various issues. And I think that's the mistake, is that we got totally cut off from and are now look as though we're outside the legal system as the ICC develops precedential law that I think is important. So I was very involved in setting up the war crimes tribunals, which many people think was the progenitor of this, and I'm for it, but I can understand, I mean, I was involved in these discussions, and they're hard, and it is that balance between the ideals and the reality, but there is a way on this particular issue to still be a part of it by being friends of the court.
Time for just these couple more. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Alexander. I work in private equity in developing countries, and I'm a Woodrow Wilson School graduate. I'd like to pick up on the theme of democracy promotion and ask you all to comment on what we do when democracy promotion doesn't turn out the way that we like it to turn out, and that would be obviously in the Palestinian territories right now, sort of what we do when they elect a regime that we don't like. Thank you.
Well, I have spent a lot of time on this in a variety of different ways. Many elections don't turn out the way you like. So one of the discussions that we had when NDI was set up was to try to figure out what democracy really was about. And you've written about this, Anne-Marie, in a brilliant way about it's not just elections. That's clear. People focus on elections, but it isn't. It is about the existence of the rule of law, the free press, and a climate of regularity. But we said at that time, the existence of an opposition party. Yes. Because the opposition party is what provides accountability to those in office, and you can't just have one election. Now, and we could talk about that more, but that is a very key part, transparency. I think that on the Palestinian issue, a number of mistakes were made, and one was what the entry fee was entering those elections in the first place. And if Hamas was not willing to give up violence as a way of operating, then even though people were pushing for the elections, I think there might have been reason not to hold those elections. And I do think that it's going to happen that people that we don't like get elected, but I think that violence, a violent means for seizing power does not a democratic election make. And I have any number of thoughts about how things could have been handled differently, but that is one of the initial ones.
If I can add 2 sentences, this is an issue that's going to come back again and again with political Islam, and we have got to grapple with it. We cannot, with Algeria, in Algeria, we didn't let the elections take place. In Hamas, we did, and I'm not sure either was the right response in terms of where we've ended up. We need exactly to sit down and figure out a set of conditions that any party that wants to run in elections has to subscribe to, that is not just U.S. conditions. These are conditions that we and other liberal democracies in the world, and indeed through the UN, can specify. You have to allow an opposition, you have to guarantee minority rights, you have to be forswear violence, you have to accept an independent judiciary. We know these conditions, and we're going to have to work on them because more and more parties, as you're going to see in various Muslim countries, there are going to be parties that are connected to the Islamist parties of various kinds, and we're going to face this issue.
One additional, if you're in emerging markets, I think one of the countries that's important to think about. It may sound Marxist, but people want to eat and vote. And therefore, democracy has to deliver. And I think we need to look more and more at the interaction of democracy and development, and how to get the poor much more involved so that, I mean, Hamas, for all its violent aspect, actually does deliver. And so does Hezbollah. So I think that we need to look at an NDI. We're looking more at how development and democracy go together.
Final question, sir.
Okay, Andy Steigman from the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. I'd like to take off on Secretary Albright's comment about the President and the administration losing support on Iraq. Our Georgetown colleague, Charles Kupchan, has an article in the Current Foreign Affairs in which he looks at essentially the problem of bringing our foreign policy to a state where it is in balance with what the American people are willing to support. That you simply can't maintain a foreign policy without popular domestic support. What do you think the next president needs to do to assure that whatever policy is chosen will in fact have the overwhelming, at least the majority, support of the American people?
Dean Slaughter, you want to start with that?
Well, the first thing that needs to happen is to actually recreate what I think is a bipartisan majority of the American people, and because right now it's not just foreign policy; it's any policy that is being deeply polarized. I do think it does go back to values. I worry that one of the lessons of the Iraq War, a false lesson in my view, will be, look, we shouldn't be out there, we shouldn't be engaged with different countries, we shouldn't be supporting democracy, not imposing it or promoting it. We should really just, try to pull back and take care of our own problems and let the rest of the world just deal with itself. That is the wrong message. Instead, we need to say, look, standing for our values, standing for democracy, standing for liberty, standing for justice and equality and tolerance is part of who we are as a country. It is part of who we have always been. It is not a mission. I absolutely agree with Secretary Albright. We shouldn't see this as some kind of divine mission. But it is who we are as a country. Long term, the American people only support that kind of a foreign policy. That's what you saw with the neocon reaction to the realism of Nixon and Kissinger. You saw a desire to actually reflect our values. But the question is how. The question is, how do you stand for your values in a way that is consistent with your values? You can't stand for justice if simultaneously you are denying anyone you call an illegal combatant any rights of any kind forever. Same thing with respect to how do you stand for liberty? How do you stand for equality? We haven't even talked about development and the Millennium Goals and the way we could work through the UN. So the way I think a new president has to go about it is to posit that we have agreement on the what that we stand for, but then bring about a bipartisan debate and then a multilateral debate on how we go about actually implementing that support.
I fully agree, and I would say, in addition to that, that what has to happen, this is the world's longest political campaign, and that rather than looking backward, we should really force all the whatever there are, 16 candidates at this point, to have a national debate. That's what this should be about, is how is a value system put in? What is the national interest of the United States? I find fascinating that the real grassroots movement that actually does exist is among students over Darfur.
Yes.
That is a real thing. And it shows that many of the younger generations see our national interest in not letting a bunch of people that live in Africa be genocidally murdered, or there is an outpouring about the environment and energy, and it's there. So I think that needs to be embellished. And then, because we can't ever have this discussion without the media,
hooray for us.
Right. I think it should be hooray for you, because what has to happen is that our media needs to do more in educating the American public. It is not about sound bites and ratings and programs where you can't even state a sentence before you're cut off. And I think that the media has a huge role to play, I think, not in espousing one program or another, but creating the medium in order to have this national debate, because we will have it, or we must have it. And what I find interesting is that we all go out and speak, is I don't actually think there is an isolationist trend. Interestingly enough, most Americans are beginning to understand the interaction between domestic and foreign policy and a desire to be part of the world. And to get our good name back, I think people really want our good name to come back. So David, to you.
As I like to say, these problems are complicated enough without bringing the media into it. So with that, thank you to our wonderful guests, and thank you for all of you.
That was a great end. Great. I will sign books.